Welcome to Effect to Change. Here's another article for you titled, He's a Spectrum, She's a Spectrum, and I Am Too. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and ring that bell. And now the article. He's a spectrum, she's a spectrum, and I am too. I'm talking about ADHD and autism. Note, this article is for information purposes only. It is not intended to be used as a diagnosis. There are multiple other neurotypes that also cross these spectrums. Main components of autism. The autism spectrum, for the sake of this article, consists of 6 major issues that a person with autism may struggle with. Sensory seeking, sensory anxiety, executive dysfunction, social challenges, sensory sensitivity, social anxiety. What are these components and how do you recognize them? It's not always easy to figure out, especially when the person shifts from one to another or they display a combination. Sensory seeking and sensory anxiety seem to be opposites, and yet, for someone with autism, they can occur simultaneously. The sensory seeking part may be off balance, uncoordinated, or unaware of personal space. Sensory anxiety comes from an overload of awareness of personal space. Every touch is an added stimulation that they don't want or need. The mind can be focused on seeking certain types of stimulation, which put all other senses on high alert. This coincides with sensory sensitivity. The brain interprets outside input as an attack, and the body tries to defend itself. Think of having a bright light shine in your eyes after being in the dark. Now magnify that to all your senses. Social challenges and social anxiety are also paired together. As a person with autism tries to navigate their social surroundings, they struggle to find their place. The questions of where to stand, how to smile, eye contact, and personal distance. Should they get closer or move away? They're getting overstimulated, but the social cues say to stay. Their minds are bombarded with decisions that neurotypicals don't have to deal with. Everything becomes a challenge. Executive dysfunction complicates matters even more. Long-term planning requires stringing step-by-step plans together. This can be impaired for people with autism. Information and stimulation can be more difficult to process. The mind needs to separate each piece of data and move it around in a way that makes sense to them. This plays a part in their time blindness, which then has a negative impact on their expected duties and relationships. Main components of ADHD. The ADHD spectrum, also for the sake of this article, consists of 6 major issues that a person with ADHD may struggle with. Hyperactivity, sensory overload, sensory seeking, sensory anxiety, social challenges, executive dysfunction. Only 2 of these are different from the autism spectrum, hyperactivity and sensory overload. Hyperactivity doesn't always mean physical. It can also mean hyperactive thoughts. You might see a person who is fidgety or staring off into space. Sitting still doesn't mean they're not hyperactive. It's an uncontrollable phenomenon that keeps their minds and/or bodies in a constant state of activity. It's exhausting, and it takes a lot of energy. Sensory overload is a situation where everything comes from everywhere all at once. Sitting in a food court at the mall, for example, is a sensory nightmare, even if it's considered to be quiet to most people. Every sound, smell, flick of light, everything bombards the mind all at the same time. It doesn't stop. It gets worse the longer the exposure. Sensory overload can alter the sense of taste so that favorite foods don't taste good. It can impair being able to hear or understand the person they're talking to. The peripheral vision picks up on every activity. When sensory overload hits, all the person wants to do is get away. It really is all the time. What you may not realize is that these components are an all-the-time thing. It's never just one or some, it's all of them, all of the time. Some of them are more prominent at times than others, giving the illusion that there has been a switch between them. It's more like a potentiometer than a switch. The dial you might use to dim a light bulb, but you're never able to turn it off. Sure, some parts turn down considerably at times, but it's still there. It can flare up and take over in a split second. Usually what you see is the one that has the most energy being routed to it, like standing outside of a house and only seeing the brightest lights. The rest of the lights are still on and the surge of power can fluctuate. ADHD and autism. They have a lot in common with each other and other neurodivergent minds. There isn't a fine line that separates one from the other. Because of this, the understanding of the relationship between ADHD and autism continues to be studied. The diagnosis spectrum that is used to determine if a person has one, both, or several sensory spectrums can vary from one medical profession to another. As more and more is learned about the human mind, about how the human mind functions, more and more treatment options become available. It's a work in progress. But then again, aren't we all?